Good day to everyone. I'm Cheska Rosales from the GVC team of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of ADB. We are here to share the team's experience with MRIO and discuss in more detail its compilation and uses. For this session, we will take a look at the coverage and structure, the data sources we used to build the MRIO, the methods we undertook, and the issues we faced in the compilation. We will also discuss some possible uses of the ADB-MRIO. Here we list the main input-output databases that are available. The Asian International Input-Output Tables compiled by the Institute of Developing Economies under the Japan External Trade Organization, or IDE-JETRO, focuses on Asia-Pacific countries. The ADB-Multiregional Input-Output provides a time series of I/O tables with matching environmental and social satellite accounts for 190 countries. The ESCAP harmonized and detailed the supply-use tables for a number of countries to estimate emissions and resource extractions by industry. The Eurostat initiated the full international and global accounts for research in input-output analysis, or the FIGARO project, to compile the EU inter-country supply use and input-output tables, which is used as a tool for analyzing socio-economic and environmental effects of globalization in the European Union. The Global MRIO Lab of the Industrial Ecology Virtual Laboratory covers the entire world and includes all data sources and data classifications that were used during the construction of global MRIO databases such as EORA, EXIOBase, and WIOD. The Global Trade Analysis Project records the annual flows of goods and services for the entire world economy in the benchmark years. The OECD also compiles inter-country input-output table covering 36 OECD and 28 non-OECD countries. The World Input-Output Tables, which was developed by the University of Groningen, cover 43 countries plus an economy for the rest of the world. Data for 56 sectors are classified according to the International Standard Industrial Classification Revision 4. Lastly, we have the ADB-MRIO with 63 countries, including the rest of the world, and 35 industries. Currently, we have IoTs for years 2000 and 2007 to 2019, and we will update the 2019 version in the first quarter of 2021. The ADB-MRIO covers 63 economies, of which 43 are consistent with the World Input-Output Database, or WIOD, 19 are ADB member countries, and 1 economy represents the rest of the world. Here we see the general schematic of an MRIO, simplified to only 3 countries and their industries. Each row indicates the amount of output produced by each country sector, separated into intermediate products and final products. The diagonals of both the intermediate consumption matrix and final consumption matrix indicate consumption of domestically produced goods and services. For example, this portion indicates goods and services produced by country A that are also consumed by country A. On the other hand, the off-diagonal entries of the 2 matrices represents goods and services that are produced internationally. For example, this portion shows goods and services exported by country B to be used by the rest of the world for production of its own goods and services. Adding the domestic and imported intermediate inputs of one country to its own value added gives us the total output of that country. Since the WIOD tables cover only 6 Asian economies, the ADB initiated a project to augment the WIOD with details from more Asian economies to facilitate the analytical needs related to the Asia-Pacific region. Apart from the WIOD, our primary data comes from country national accounts, which were gathered under a technical assistance program of ADB. These were complemented with information from several other databases, both from country sources, which form the direct core, and international databases, which form the extended core of information. In the process of the compilation, we also established a feedback mechanism with data partners and users to improve the accuracy of the MRIO. At this point, we will be discussing our team's compilation method. This starts with the harmonization of product and industry classification. For ADB-MRIO, the main objective was to augment the existing world input-output tables to include 19 participating economies under ADB's Regional Capacity Development Technical Assistance Project 8838. A key publication for this project is the Compendium of Supply and Use Tables for Selected Economies in Asia and the Pacific. This can be found in ADB's website. As mentioned earlier, our primary data sources are national accounts, specifically country supply and use tables. These SUTs, which are collected from different countries, come in different shapes due to differing economic structures. Hence, in order to consolidate these country IoTs into one multi-regional IoT, we need to use standard bridge or correspondence tables published by the UN Statistics Division to map different classifications into ADB's 35 main sectors. In cases where we use the country IoT or the WIOD, we map the sectors into 35 industries using ISIC revision 3.1. When we aggregate sectors, it is important to note that there is a trade-off between the level of uniformity and the level of information embedded in generating consistent multi-country IoTs. Compilers of multi-country SUTs and IoTs have to conduct thorough examination of conceptual as well as methodological differences among countries in the estimation of basic statistics for the national SUTs and IoTs, and if necessary, to carry out pre-adjustment to these tables onto a common format prior to the compilation of a multi-country IoT. In general, it is often the case that the statistics of detailed and information-rich tables have to be adjusted to conform to those that are less detailed in order to achieve commonality, unless there is a good prospect of obtaining additional information for upgrading the less detailed tables. In breaking down sectors, we rely on several sources for basis of disaggregation. This chart shows the sources based on robustness and level of reliance. We mainly look at administrative sources such as turnover data, merchandise trade, and employment. But whenever this data is not available, we use structures of similar economies with available information. In other cases, we make use of similar inter-country input-output databases such as the OECD Inter-Country IoT or modeled estimates released by various research publications. Not all countries produce annual supply and use table or input-output table. For this, we employ some non-survey methods to acquire the gap years. There are three main non-survey approaches we can use to fill in data for missing years. The first option is to perform extrapolation on the desired data using trends in direct input coefficients of benchmark years and annual national accounts statistics. Once we extrapolate, we normalize the results such that each element adds up to control figures. The second option is to employ the marginal inputs coefficient method by Miller and Blair, wherein we relate the change in the amount of input I purchased by industry J to the change in the total amount industry J produced. Lastly, we may also employ the generalized RAS algorithm by Temershoff and the modified RAS algorithm by Paylink and Whalebrook to populate a matrix given a certain level of output. Since some are uncomfortable with automated balancing, some checks may be placed to ensure that there are no drastic changes from initial estimates. These checks include looking at errors of coefficient, mean absolute deviation, mean absolute percentage error, and partitive and holistic accuracy checks. As much as possible, ADB uses manual balancing so that we can better investigate suspicious data. The main data source we use for building the bilateral trade matrices is the UN Comtrade database, which is available by trade partner and is HS classified up to 6 digits. We also used the expanded balance of payments statistics, which were mapped into the ADB-MRIO sectors. In case countries or certain years are missing in the Comtrade, such as Taipei, China, as well as the splitting of Bell-Lux Economic Union, we take a look at other sources such as data published by national statistics agencies, the IMF Direction of Trade Statistics, OECD WTO Balanced Trade in Services, other available MRIOs, and the Observatory of Economic Complexity by MIT. Here is a broad overview of how bilateral trade vectors are expanded into matrices by trade partners. We start off with building the imports matrix of trade partners. Goods import vectors from official sources are first adjusted for CIF, or cost insurance and freight, to become uniform to the valuation of exports in the national accounts. Then, we split the imported inputs by broad economic uses, that is, intermediate, final, and capital goods, using the broad economic classification from the UN. We multiply these controlled total imports by broad economic uses to an import matrix published by the NSO or derived from our SUT to IoT transformation process. If these are not available, we make use of the EORA structure. Because of data issues for some economies, we need to employ the proportionality assumption in order to split the imported inputs into 35 sectors. For this, our team uses the ratio of imported inputs to total intermediate consumption. After getting the import matrices, we now split them by trading partner. For this step, we use the data from the UN Comtrade, Direction of Trade Statistics from the IMF, and the OECD WTO Balanced Trade in Services. Once imports are split by trade partner, we proceed to create export matrices using a parallel estimation. The process is the same, but the roles of countries are switched. Due to varying sources, exports of, say, country A to country B may not be equivalent to imports of country B from country A. Some investigative approaches may be employed whenever trade asymmetries arise. First, we can ask which trade flow to prioritize in case of asymmetry. According to the World Integrated Trade Solution, and as echoed by Timmer in 2012, imports are usually recorded with more accuracy because of tariffs and duties. Another question to consider is which data reporter to honor. Several researchers suggested the use of indicators for reporter reliability based on discrepancies at the commodity partner level. Symmetry index is then computed between exports and imports to give more weight to countries with data that is more consistent with trading partners' data. Lastly, we may employ the top-down approach in investigating for discrepancies, wherein we start looking for inaccuracies at the highest levels of aggregation and go down to more detailed information. This way enables easier flagging of misdirected and misclassified trade. The last step of compilation is the reconciliation and balancing of row and column sums. For this, we use a mix of investigative approach or manual balancing and automated balancing, mainly for final roundups. In balancing the MRIO, our team prioritizes the manual approach as it allows us to more closely evaluate an underlying sources, look at before and after comparisons, and check for outliers within the time series. Remaining discrepancies are adjusted using the modified RAS approach, but it is done separately for domestic and external trade matrices to avoid drastic changes from the original unbalanced table. Balancing the MRIO will cause some changes in the initially constructed structure, but should not be significantly different from the original unbalanced table. To address this, we do some plausibility checks, such as looking at GVA to output ratios, changes in GVA weights, and so on. Where do we use the multi-regional input-output tables? With a growing interest in analyzing the impact of globalization and the international fragmentation of production, the role of SUTs and IoTs has been revitalized. MRIOTs have been proven useful in three key areas of analysis. First is in international trade, which involves analysis in trade in value added, global value chains, and bilateral trade balances. Second, MRIOTs have been used in environmental and economic applications such as regulation and taxation, and studies on the footprint of production activities around the world. For example, analysis of carbon footprint. Lastly, MRIOTs play a role in analysis involving labor markets and globalization. Topics under this key area include income distribution, impact on jobs, labor productivity and wages, and employment content of trade. MRIOTs reveal the multilateral nature of bilateral trade balances in the age of global value chains. Our team has performed some analysis using the ADB-MRIO. For example, taking a look at the PRC-US trade in computer, electronics, and optical equipment sector, we see that 74% of value added in exports in the US are domestically produced. On the other hand, only a mere 46% of value added in exports is domestic value added for PRC, leaving 54% of value added in exports coming from third countries. Hence, any effect of the current PRC-US trade conflict is mostly absorbed by these third countries, which contribute in the exports production of PRC. MRIOTs also allow for disentangling production processes relevant to global value chains. We can decompose production activity to those only relating to GVCs and create indices that show the level of participation of a given country in the global value chain. In this slide, we plot the forward GVC participation index of selected countries against their backward GVC participation and index across selected years. We generally see positive relationships across all years, with the observation that high backward participation is correlated with high forward participation. Also, looking at Thailand, we see that both of its forward and backward participation indices were initially increasing, but its backward participation starts to decline at year 2010, while its forward participation continues to rise. MRIOTs help us understand the changing nature of trade. Here we show network charts for Thailand's interaction with other countries. The shortlisted 63 countries in the network charts are based on the ADB Economic Indicators Input-Output Tables publications. Each node represents one country, and its size pertains to the country's volume of forward GVC participation. The thickness of edges or lines represents the bilateral volume of domestic value added through forward linkage. A lower boundary of 5,000 in millions was implemented for visible edges or lines, naturally trimming off vertices with only small volumes of domestic value added through the forward linkage. We see that while Thailand is already involved in trade with a number of countries in 2000, domestic value added through the forward linkages is relatively low as shown by the thinness of the lines. While the number of countries Thailand has been in trade remained the same over the years, we see that the magnitude of trade significantly increases, especially with PRC, the US, Malaysia, Japan, and Bangladesh. We note that these charts are not merely hand-drawn, but rather are derived from and are visual representations of the datasets themselves. Some studies estimate the footprint of production activities using the multi-regional input-output table. Here is a study by Zheng, Wang, and Ren using the input-output table of PRC. They found that the industries which contribute significantly to the economic well-being of PRC also contribute significantly to total carbon emissions, albeit the embodied carbon emission multipliers for most industries are decreasing, while the industrial carbon emission structures of PRC did not significantly change over time. Performing structural decompositions at different levels of aggregation, Bertuflo, Gentile, and De Vries analyzed the relative impacts of technology, task relocation, and consumption levels on changes on total employment by country and sector. They have observed that technological change within GVC is generally associated with a decrease in employment across all occupation types, although routine occupations are relatively more affected. Their results show that domestic final demand is associated with an 11% increase in employment for the 12 Asian developing member countries as a whole. Taipei, China is the only economy that shows a decrease in employment associated with domestic final demand, whereas Malaysia at 35% and Philippines at 24% show the largest increases. On the other hand, jobs induced by final demand from advanced economies have decreased by 1% for the 12 developing member countries as a whole. Vietnam is the economy where final demand from advanced countries was the most important source of increased job demand, followed by Taipei, China, and the Republic of Korea. Rapid technological changes occurring in these three economies, which implies that fewer workers are needed to satisfy the same level of demand. The European Central Bank, in its sixth Economic Bulletin issue in 2020, used the ADB-MRIO table to quantify the impact of adverse shocks from COVID-19 containment measures originating in the euro area on the region's GDP, foreign trade, and trade balances. Dinino and Veltri observed that a shock originating in one of the five largest economies, that is, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands, transmitted to the rest of the euro area, will be 15 to 28% larger than the initial effect. They also looked into global value chains, distinguishing deep GVC exports, or the share that crosses at least two borders, as intermediates enter one border for processing and are re-exported for further processing elsewhere, vis-a-vis shallow GVC exports, or the share of exports that directly reaches the final transforming economy. In 2018, more than two-thirds of their exports within the EU are considered deep GVC exports, while majority of trade with other regions are shallow GVC exports. Comparing GVC exports within the euro area and with its main trading partners in 2008 and 2018, they observed that the shortening of value chain was offset by deeper integration within the regional network in the euro area and with the rest of the EU. Our team here in ADB also used the MRIO to have an initial assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on trade and production. The team compiled a counterfactual table, or a table of projected 2020 values prior to the pandemic, which was mostly based on World Bank forecasts. Then, the impact of the COVID-19 was simulated using three scenarios. The first assumes that the changes in final demand components observed in the first half of 2020 will have the same trend until the end of the year. For example, if published GDP estimates show that the final consumption expenditure of households dropped by 5% in the first half of the year, then we assume that the full year growth rate of household final consumption expenditure is also at 5%. The second assumes that changes in final demand components observed in the first half of 2020 will not continue until the end of the year. Instead, the expected changes in final demand components for 2020 are 50% better than in the first scenario. The third assumes that changes in final demand components in the second half of the year will be around 10% worse than what was observed in the first half of the year. This was based on OECD data during the SARS outbreak, where the 2002 full-year GDP growth rate in some countries was weaker than in the first half of 2002. Due to the pandemic, ASEAN plus 3 countries may collectively lose $1.9 to $2.6 trillion in nominal gross domestic product in 2020, of which 161.2 up to $248.1 billion may come from value-added exports. To complement the WIOD and ADB-MRIO tables, the ADB-LAC MRIO tables were compiled using the structure similar to WIOD and CEPAL. These tables were constructed for 2007, 2011, and 2017, covering 71 economies, rest of Latin American countries, and the rest of the world. The rest of Latin American countries include Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. All other economies are aggregated under the rest of the world. The published supply and use tables or input-output tables were used for the structure of the domestic tables of Latin American countries. For years where no SUT or IOT is available, the structure of the most recent SUT or IOT or the matriz Sudamericana of CEPAL IPEA, whichever is closest to the year of interest, was applied. In cases where the 2005 or 2011 matriz Sudamericana was adopted, the domestic IO matrix was updated to 2007 or 2017 using the published control totals. The sectors were mapped into the ADB-MRIO 35 sectors. In the works are the extension of these tables disaggregated into 38 sectors. Bilateral trade matrices were constructed through the similar approach as we discussed in earlier slides. Balancing is also done manually first before adopting a modified RAS approach separately for domestic and external trade matrices for the final roundup. As ways forward, given the rising demand to capture global value chains and global trade, more statistical work is required in order to support analytical efforts. This will require not just augmenting the coverage country-wise and sector-wise for more specialized industry analysis, but also enhancing the coverage of ancillary databases that extend the analytical capacity of IoTs while keeping intact the core accounts. Our team's next step is to add more countries and years into the MRIO database. We are targeting the first quarter of next year for the 2019 final table and the 2020 preliminary table, while we are targeting November for this year for the expansion of the ADB-MRIO LAC to 38 sectors. Other projects in the pipeline include disaggregating sectors, updating the ISIC version used for classification, extending the IO to include ancillary databases such as employment and capital, and update the tables to consider megacities, satellite accounts, constant prices, and social accounting matrix. Should you have any questions, please email us at the addresses flashed on the screen.